why stuff happens. There's a big difference between an excuse and an explanation, right? So the idea that racism is something people just float out there for the hell of it, like just making it up to sort of, you know, get out of their own problems in life is preposterous. And for somebody that makes $15 million a film, I guess they can say that, right? But for the rest of people of color in this country, sort of having a much more nuanced understanding of how it operates, that's a dangerous kind of mentality. Unfortunately, it was President Obama himself, to some extent, who implanted this notion in the minds of the American public back 6 years ago. Because if you remember in 2004, at the Democratic National Convention, when most of us had never heard of Barack Obama, he was at that time a state senator in Illinois, running for the United States Senate, but he would not win that seat until that fall. So this was during the summer in Boston at the Democratic Convention, and he stood up and gave this keynote address, and it was really the first time that most of us had heard of him, the first major national speech he'd ever given. And one of the biggest applause lines from that speech is where he said the following. He said, "We're not a black America and a white America, a Latino America and an Asian America. We're just the United States of America." And everybody in the audience was, oh, the time he gave the speech. And it's true now. So we can't say we're one United States of America when that kind of thing is in the picture, when you have that level of division. Since Barack Obama became a national political figure and now president, he has, of course, perhaps because he felt that he had to, and perhaps because he simply chose to, avoided discussing, by and large, issues of race, unless he was forced into that, as in the case of the speech he gave after all the uproar about Reverend Jeremiah Wright's comments, which, for those who aren't clear on this, what Reverend Wright said about American history is far more accurate than that which you learn in history class going back to junior high school. But the president, of course, had to distance himself from Reverend Wright at the time of those comments, and he did so. Other than that, he's rarely ever talked about race at all. In fact, the other night during the keynote address, if you paid close attention to it, if you saw any portion of it, it was interesting. He talked about all kinds of different groups in society and what their needs were. Talked about small business owners, talked about rural folks and farmers and people in small towns, right? Talked about the middle class, talked about all these different, but he did not talk about race at all. Did not talk about racial division at all. Again, sort of making it seem as though there are lots of interest groups in society that we want to mention, but we can't talk about people of color. Because if I do that, what's going to happen? Well, if I do that, he's saying, I'm sure, I'm going to be attacked for playing a race card or pandering to black and brown folk, right? So we can pander to small town folk, middle class folk, whatever that's supposed to mean, right? But we can't talk about race. You can't talk about that unemployment among black and Latino and Asian Americans with college degrees being so much higher than white folks. You can't talk about the fact that Chinese American professionals, who as a group in this country are more likely to have a college degree than white professionals, more likely to have a graduate degree than white professionals, but only earn about 56% of what white professionals earn. So you have basically white professionals earning, what is that? That's a 44% more than white professionals earning 44% more than their Chinese American counterparts, even when we're talking about the Chinese American counterparts having more education. So whether we're talking about black folks, Latino folk, Asian American folk, the disparities are huge, and yet the president can't even talk about that. Can't talk about people of color being 2 to 3 times more likely than white folks to have been roped into those high-cost mortgage loans that are exploding right now all around the country, people losing their homes. It's affecting everyone to some extent, but now black and brown folk are 2 to 3 times more likely to have gotten sucked in to those loans, even though their credit records were good enough, they should have been able to get a loan at the regular rate. We're not talking about people whose credit history was so bad that that's the only kind of loan they could have qualified for. We're talking about folks who, had they been white, would have been given a lower cost loan, but they were taken advantage of because of race, because of ethnicity, because of presumptions on the part of banks and lending institutions that they were higher risk in spite of the evidence. But he couldn't talk about that. He can't talk about it with regard to health care. So when he talks about the health care issue, when all of us do in this country, how much conversation have we heard about the health disparities between white folks on the one hand and people of color on the other? Very little. Even though those disparities are huge. Now, some people say, well, Timmy doesn't have to talk about that because, you know, the whole point of getting universal health care coverage is going to be to help everyone, and this is his argument, actually. He says, well, if we get universal coverage, you know, disproportionately people of color will benefit, because disproportionately they're the ones who are likely to lack insurance. But what we need to understand is that the health care disparities between white folks and people of color are not just about coverage. It's not just about black and brown folks not having insurance, and so if we can just get them insurance, everything will be fine. Even when peoples of color have insurance, Even when people of color have good incomes, even when people of color have college degrees, even when their occupations are pretty high paying, their health outcomes are worse than the health outcomes for working class and poor white people. So if you take African American women, for example, who have babies, African American women with college degrees, right, who by and large will have health insurance, by and large will have decent jobs. Right? Maybe not the kind of high-paying jobs that white college graduates have, but still, these are not people who are typically likely to be at the bottom of the economic ladder. African American women with college degrees actually have higher rates of infant mortality for their children, higher rates of low birth weight children being born than white women who dropped out after the 8th grade, who almost always are poor, who very rarely have got health insurance coverage. So you have poor white women actually having better health outcomes for them and their children than black women who are not at all poor. The research says that when black and Latino women and even South Asian Indian women start off poor and then start to move up the ladder, the health of they and their children do not improve. On the other hand, for white folks, when they're poor and they start to move up, their health does improve. What's going on? Well, the research says that the reason folks of color don't have the same boost for a better economic situation, the reason they don't get the same health benefits from having better jobs and more income and insurance is because folks of color are dealing with the cumulative effects of discrimination every day. And those cumulative effects have an impact on the body. That it actually affects the release of stress hormones like cortisol, right? That can actually affect blood flow, affect hypertension, affect the kinds of things that lead to heart disease. So when you're black or brown and dealing with that kind of stuff all the time, the fact that you have health insurance isn't enough. You might be able to see a doctor, and it's a good thing because you're going to need a doctor a lot, right? Because there's this whole additional level of stress. There was an article actually released today from some medical journal. I got an email thing about it this morning, an alert, right, from Google or whatever, that found that for African American folk with significant experiences with discrimination, they actually there's a protein in the blood that they're able to find. They've done these studies where they check the blood, and there's this protein that's being given off that can be affected by stress that is much higher in those black folks who have lots of experience with discrimination as compared to those who have less experience with it. So what's going on, right? You have people that are experiencing greater levels of discrimination. It's affecting the way that certain proteins, the way that certain stress hormones are being released into the bloodstream. This is affecting health. And so we can't just deal with the health problem by making sure everybody's got coverage. We have to also make sure that we're addressing the specific impact of racism on folks' lives, but yet racism and discrimination are not considered public health issues. We haven't announced them as public health emergencies the way we do for other things, but they're affecting people's lives just as surely.